What has happened, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back to review the new film Materialists, written and directed by Celine Song and starring Dakota Johnson, Chris Evans, and Pedro Pascal. Basically, your typical crossover between Madam Web, Steve Rogers, and Reed Richards. But in all seriousness, here is the official premise ripped straight from the pages of IMDb. A young, ambitious New York City matchmaker finds herself torn between the perfect match and her imperfect ex. And for anybody who's been following this channel for any length of time, they might be justifiably asking themselves, why is James reviewing Materialists? It is because it was either Materialists or the live-action photorealistic remake of How to Train Your Dragon. And I'm sorry, I don't go to see live-action remakes of cartoons that came out like last week. I mean, the original How to Train Your Dragon is not that old. And even if it weren't that old, I still wouldn't go see How to Train Your Dragon, the remake. But Materialists? I'm interested in A24, and I like following them, and I like having an informed opinion about their output. And I find it interesting that as A24 tries to increase the size and the scope and the visibility of their movies, they're becoming less like an independent studio and much more like a traditional studio, which means romantic comedies, romantic dramas, and Materialists. I think the best approach to take is going to be similar to that of a recent video I saw reviewing a cigar. And when you're reviewing a cigar, they review it by the first third, the middle third, and the last third. And the first third of Materialists, I was loving it. I mean, Dakota Johnson, she's on fire. Celine Song wrote her an incredible part. It's kind of devilish and mischievous, but also a little bit cynical and a little mean-spirited and very satirical and pretty harsh and just ruthless about the dating scene here in New York and how so many people live in total denial about what attributes they might bring to the table versus those attributes they're seeking in a potential match. And I was thinking to myself, you know what, there's going to be at least initially, this is what I thought, there are going to be a lot of people who compare this movie unfavorably to Past Lives, Celine Song's previous film. However, I might be in that small minority that argues that Materialists is a better movie. However, by the time this movie gets to the middle of the cigar or the end of the cigar, it gets very long, very tedious, very slow, very serious. And that unique blend which characterized the first third of the movie, basically a mix of like glass of champagne as well as stiletto into your ribcage, that's all forgotten, and the movie just becomes, I don't know, just a total drag to watch. And it's so unfortunate because I feel like Celine Song exhibits enormous talent in that first third because there's a giant opening right now in the overall movie-going marketplace for great romantic comedies and/or that kind of satirical send-ups of just how ridiculous people can be when they're dating. And obviously now that Celine Song is a successful filmmaker, a filmmaker with high visibility here in New York, I imagine she's seen firsthand a lot of the crazy behavior exhibited by the characters in this movie. Case in point, there's one character in this movie where she acknowledges the only reason she's marrying her husband is because it makes her sister jealous. So the time is ripe for a brand new writer-director to kind of take center stage as the great satirist or the great observer of human relationships, especially if you've got a little bit of sex, a little bit of romance, and a little hint of tragedy. But goddamn, it's almost like at a certain point she's like, oh, I've forgotten to take myself too seriously. I've forgotten to insert the requisite amount of navel-gazing, and the movie slowly but surely just becomes unbearable to watch. And I think that's in large part due to the fact that Chris Evans' character and Pedro Pascal's character, they're seriously underwritten. They are pretty one-dimensional, pretty one-note, pretty boring. The way you see them at the beginning of the movie is precisely how you will see them for the rest of the movie. And with Chris Evans, he's trying to play this guy where he's a waiter and a failed actor working in like an experimental theater here in New York. And I'm sorry, once you've played Captain America in 3 Captain America movies and 4 Avengers movies, the ability for the audience to perceive you as a failed actor with kind of rough hair and dirty t-shirts, that's gone. Unless you're just an absolute chameleon. Like Christian Bale, he could probably pull that off. Chris Evans, though, he's a good-looking guy. He's a hunky guy. But he's not Laurence Olivier. He's not an actor of tremendous depth. And it's like he already won the lottery, so he can't go back to playing these kinds of roles at all. And also, quick side note to Chris Evans, he needs to put back on the muscles. I feel like as he's gotten older, he's hitting the gym less regularly, and he's starting to look very like kind of slender and gaunt, almost like Steve Rogers in Captain America: The First Avenger before he takes the injection, which allows him to become, all puffed up. But there's nothing wrong with going to the gym and maintaining a little muscle tone in your shoulders and chest and that sort of thing. So yeah, Chris Evans, I just felt like he was horribly miscast, and also it's just not a very good performance by the great Chris Evans. But I think Pedro Pascal comes across much better, especially in the first third where, as they describe in the movie, he is the unicorn, where he is perfect in every way. Because of Dakota Johnson's character's occupation, she's really good at figuring out, like, what does somebody bring to the table physically, financially, politically, socially? Like, she has all these different criteria by which she measures people. And in her own words, Pedro Pascal, he's a 10 out of 10 in every single category. And part of the initial sexy charm of the movie is watching Dakota Johnson's character in her capacity as an industry pro, a professional matchmaker, explaining to this unicorn how her attributes, they're insufficient to make her a suitable match for this character in any way, shape, or form, but he's naive enough to still believe in things like love and so on and so forth. And that's kind of the real meat of the movie initially. Do you want compatibility or do you want love? Like, do you want somebody that shares your worldview and will agree with you about current events? Do you want somebody who is educated at similar schools and will want to send their kids to similar places? Do you come from a similar background, like, happy family or broken home? Like, what is your background? What makes you compatible with somebody versus falling in love with somebody? And do people even believe in love? And with Dakota Johnson's character, now she's much more practical, much more pragmatic, much more cynical. But she knows she's at least capable of love because at one time she was in love with the character played by Chris Evans. But all they ever did was fight about money. Where are they going to park the car? Where are they going to go to eat? 'Cause once again, he's a completely broke actor, and she was a broke actor as well before transitioning into her new career path. And even then, she's still suffering financially, but she is on much better footing than Chris Evans' character. But getting back to Pedro for a moment, I should add that Pedro Pascal might be suffering from a small overexposure problem at this point. Not only was he recently in The Last of Us as well as Materialists, but we have him in Eddington and Fantastic Four First Steps all next month, so maybe he could tap the brakes and just pick and choose his parts a little more carefully. But where this movie really shines and had both me as well as the rest of the audience howling with laughter are these one-on-one interviews when Dakota Johnson's character is meeting with potential clients and they're going over the list of all the things they want in a potential match. And initially, she's much more helpful in trying to help them find what they perceive as true love or somebody that will make them feel valuable or at least appreciated or respected. But as she starts to get a little bit more cynical over the course of the movie, she starts sharing some harsh truths and harsh observations with her clients. And I was just absolutely cracking up. And it just blows my mind that the writer, Celine Song, would say, all right, so all this stuff that's making this story so much fun to watch unfold, we're just going to throw it all away and turn it into the most lifeless, drab, serious, downbeat drama that is just completely, totally unendurable. And because her last movie was a success, Past Lives, I imagine most of the execs and producers at A24 are like, you know what, just let her do her thing. Like, I'm not going to give her any notes. Like, are you going to give her notes? I'm not giving her notes. Like, that's your job. No, that's your job. I'm sure there are a lot of people who wanted to point out, you've got an incredible idea for a movie. You've got a great start for a movie. And this happens with a lot of writers where they have an incredible pitch, an incredible concept, but no follow through. And once again, going back to the cigar analogy, if your cigar is not fun to smoke in the first third, middle third, and final third, well then ultimately your movie's not going to be fun to watch. And when it comes to whose job it might have been to point out to Celine Song that her screenplay needed more work, I think her husband probably should have done so because, as she says publicly, he's the first person to read all of her screenplays because he is also a successful screenwriter. He wrote the movies Challengers as well as Queer for director Luca Guadagnino, and he's also adapting the Don Winslow novel City on Fire. As far as like the New York filmmaking kind of celebrity scene is concerned, Celine Song and her husband Justin Kuritsky, if I'm saying his last name correctly, it's kind of a mouthful. In any case, they are definitely a filmmaking celebrity couple on the New York scene right now. But if he's the first person to read all of her scripts, he would have done her a solid and said, Celine, my dear, my love, I worship you, I adore you, you're a very talented storyteller, but your story needs more work. And I say this knowing full well that I'm not necessarily the target audience for this kind of movie. I'm the target audience for movies where the first half of the movie is all gladiatorial combat and the second half is all Roman orgies and then everybody dies and the movie's over. Like, yes, give me more of that. However, I'm not immune to the charm of a good movie about relationships. In the 1930s and in the 1970s, they made a lot of movies that I really like on the front. And I know that's a bit of a cop-out, like, oh, you say you like these kinds of movies, but you're only willing to praise movies that are either 90 years old or 50 years old? Well, go fuck yourself, because those are the movies I like. Because back in the 1930s, you had masters like Ernst Lubitsch or Frank Capra or Howard Hawks or George Cukor who would excel at making these kind of these battle of the sexes movies like It Happened One Night or 20th Century or Gregory LaCava's My Man Godfrey. I mean, there were just so many good ones being made back then, and people just ate them up with a spoon. And they're so goddamn funny, and they're so sexy, and they're so much fun to watch. And in the 1970s, you start getting some really interesting like sexual politics in movies like Mike Nichols' Carnal Knowledge or Woody Allen's Annie Hall and things like that. So once again, when these movies are done well with incredible wit and charm and style, I will watch them all day, every day, no problem. But starting in the 1990s, when I was a teenager and in my early 20s, romantic comedies started getting really cheesy. And that's when people started condescendingly referring to these kinds of movies as chick flicks because they were so sentimental and so sweet and so idealized that only teenage girls dreaming of falling in love could possibly watch them without vomiting, and that's when I stopped watching them altogether. However, as somebody who loves the movie business, loves the history of movies, and wants the movie business to thrive both as a business as well as an art form at all times, the overall movie-going product that is available worldwide needs great romantic comedies. If you want the movie business to thrive, every conceivable genre out there for every conceivable kind of audience deserves to have good examples of that type of movie getting made. So even if I find romantic comedies from the 1990s to be unendurable, I recognize that there is a market for that kind of overly sentimental hogwash. But what I liked about Materialists is that it wasn't sentimental. It was just so ruthless and so practical and so just relentless in its observation of how ridiculous people can behave when they're aggressively pursuing a relationship while at the same time maintaining ridiculously high standards for everybody else apart from themselves. And so it's such a disappointment to report that this movie completely, totally falls to pieces, especially when it's such an incredible showcase for Dakota Johnson. I love Dakota Johnson. Ever since I first saw her as that Stanford student in The Social Network, which was, like 15 years ago, she's managed to put together a great filmography. And obviously that includes all the 50 Shades of Grey movies, which I did not see, but I've seen highlights. But those movies were very successful. Or she'll make turkeys like Madam Web, where she at least was trying to make a good superhero movie, and I feel like she was let down by all the writers and filmmakers involved in that particular project. But along the way, she's managed to appear in some cool stuff like A Bigger Splash from Luca Guadagnino, or Suspiria, also Luca Guadagnino, or Bad Times at the El Royale. She's got some good movies in her back pocket that she's been a part of, and I'll be rooting for her moving forward because I just love her incredibly calm, low-key energy in interviews. She's one of the most mellow actors I've ever seen, and also perfectly willing to make fun of Hollywood movies when they're terrible. And there's one great interview where she was being interviewed about the Spider-Man franchise, where she claimed that she could name all the Tom Holland Spider-Man movies.
Can you name the 3 Spider-Man Tom Holland movies?
Yeah.
Should I just go on faith?
Yeah.
Oh.
Spider-Man, here he comes.
Here he comes.
That's number 1.
Yep.
Spider-Man, and he's back.
She's got a very ironic and kind of sedate sense of humor, which I find to be irresistible, and obviously she's very easy on the eyes. I love long hair. She's a very pretty girl. She's obviously not shy either, whether you're talking about movies like Suspiria or the 50 Shades movies. So she's a full package. I am a fan, but because she's so fantastic in the first third of this movie, I do think it will remain a good calling card for her, and she has other movies coming up, like Splitsville coming out later this year. Also, I'm about to contradict myself because earlier I was talking about how we need to have every genre firing on all cylinders in order to have a healthy, thriving film culture. But before this movie started, I must have seen trailers for 5 or 6 different romantic dramas and or romantic comedies. And with each one, I was like, ugh, these look terrible. It's like when the men in your romantic dramas have a bigger vagina than the women, then perhaps you need to recast those roles and find the modern day equivalent of Burt Reynolds, or at a minimum bring in someone like Glenn Powell. But I was watching some of these trailers. I was like, yeah, I have zero interest in seeing any of these movies. But once again, I hope they do well. And I think the most nauseatingly sentimental trailer of them all was the trailer for A Big, Bold, Beautiful Journey starring Colin Farrell and Margot Robbie. But I have a very dear friend who works at Sony, and she says the movie's amazing, so I'll take her word for it. I might not see it, but I hope the movie does incredibly well for both her sake as well as everybody that she works with at Sony. But yeah, it's funny. It's one of those things where I want romantic comedies to thrive, but I'm just going to be very selective and I'm going to be very choosy about which ones that I want to see. And if a better blockbuster had been out today, apart from How to Train Your Dragon, perhaps I wouldn't even have seen Materialists. But like I said before, I do like having an informed opinion about A24. The rivalry between A24 and Neon is absolutely fascinating. And I'm rooting for both companies. I feel like a little healthy competition goes a long way. And I like how they're investing in romantic comedies and horror movies and a bunch of other categories that the big studios sometimes ignore. The big studios like to make animation for children, big sci-fi movies, big superhero movies, big franchises, big IP. But I like original movies with an adult sensibility. So even if I was disappointed by Materialists, at a minimum, it's an original R-rated movie from an interesting author, writer, director. And while this movie wasn't made for me, I'll be rooting for Celine Song moving forward, and I'll be very curious to see what the future might bring in her association with A24. And I'll be rooting for her husband as well, because I think he's got some chops as well. Challengers was a very well-written movie. I think of the kind of the celebrity duo of these two very successful screenwriters that are married to each other, Justin probably writes movies that are more to my taste, but if your thing is past lives, more power to you. I'll be curious to see how the past lives fanatics regard Materialists. I'm assuming a lot of them are going to regard it as a sophomore slump. I wasn't as obsessed with Past Lives or as enamored with it, but it's not. I wasn't like antagonistic toward it. Just like not my kind of movie. But it'll be interesting to see if there's any sort of pushback from the Past Lives fanatics when it comes to the way they digest Materialists. At any rate, I feel like I've said all that I need to say. Materialists is 1/3 of a good cigar, and if that sounds like your thing, go see it in the theater. But I have much higher hopes for the movie that I'm seeing next week when I've got 28 Years Later on deck. Talking about movies that are tailor-made for my tastes and preferences. Yeah, I mean, I like gladiators and orgies, but I also like apocalyptic dystopian hellholes filled with rage virus psychopaths and that sort of thing. So yeah, fingers crossed for 28 Years Later to deliver next week. But I hope you enjoyed this video. If so, please consider liking, subscribing, hitting the notification bell. But I hope everyone has a great weekend at the movies, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.